All right, we might make a start there, and if anyone sort of joins, they can join in along the way. This is being recorded as well, so there'll be a recording sent out to everyone who's registered. If you want to watch anything back, or you need to refresh your memory about anything that we covered today. But welcome, guys. Thanks for your time to out of your day to have a look at the Giraffe 101. So today is going to be a sort of fundamental session. We're obviously going to be in the new Giraffe 5. So a lot of you might be new here, but we've just recently done a bit of an upgrade to what we can see on the screen. Some nice little enhancements and fixes that the team has been working hard on over the last few months there. So you've come at a great time. And what we're going to do is just talk through a bit of a feasibility, a walkthrough, starting from scratch, searching from a site, and then building up something similar to what we can see on the screen here. So this is a little bit of a feasibility project that I've built out as part of this demonstration and other demos in Sydney, Australia. So that's where I'm based. I'm part of the customer success team here at Giraffe, and we're based in Milsons Point, which is just across the Sydney Harbour Bridge over there. So this is a little project. You can see some of the capability of Giraffe and what we can sort of start to pull out in terms of numbers. So on the right-hand side, there's some numbers that are all being communicated by the geometry that we draw on the screen. But I'm going to sort of step back and talk you through all of that process. But just to give you an idea of what is capable in Giraffe, as I'm sure most of you are probably familiar, and that's why you're here today. But yes, so let me open up a new project and we can get started. So I'm just going to create a new project from the project drop-down list. I don't want to start from a template. I just want to start from scratch. So here, when you open up Giraffe, it'll load into, well, based on your location. So I'm located in Sydney. It's recognized my IP address and positioned me accordingly. And we can see here some geometry that's populating on the screen by default. So with every project you create, you get a base map group. And within this comes a series of data layers. So we can see here, there's the 3D buildings. We've got map labels, trees, landmark buildings. So that's a new addition through our Mapbox API. So we harness that, and that's what we sort of display on the screen here. So your Mapbox, you'd be familiar with other platforms like Uber, Strava, if you're a runner. They all use that same Mapbox platform. So to give you a bit of reassurance in the reliability of the geometry and what's being populated on the map as well. These are all individual layers as well. So I can sort of toggle through and say, turn off all the 3D buildings. And then we're just left with the landmark buildings. But if we didn't want to see those landmark for some reason, we can turn them off and they're replaced by their sort of default version in place of that. So we do have a lot of control over the layers and what we can see. We've obviously got some, excuse me, we've got some points of interest labels as well, transit labels, which is sort of your train, bus stations, and some other information that loads via default. So Giraffe is an urban analytics platform. So the idea here is that we can centralize a lot of that information that would otherwise be a little bit disjointed. And we can pull that together in one platform through the form of layers and basically stack them on top of each other. So when we are looking at a project, say that one over here that I was looking at previously, we can better inform the decisions based on that data and how we're looking at a design proposal potentially on that site. So that's what we're going to talk through today. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll be monitoring that. Otherwise, I think you guys can maybe unmute yourself and talk. But if not, just drop them in the chat and I will get to them throughout the session. So when we open up Giraffe, the first thing we need to do is actually save a project. And just before we save a project, I might give a bit of a rundown of the interface and what we can see here on the screen. So Across the top, we've got our toolbar. So we've got some admin, some options, our project drop-down list. The drawing toolbar is in the top bar up the center. And then on each side, we've got sort of our panel tabs. So on the left-hand side is our layers panel. And there's a number of other options that we have listed here, such as views, settings, usage editor, which we'll go through throughout the demonstration. But just knowing that these are sort of the options that we can cycle through. We can collapse these toolbars as well, which is really nice. So if you're working on a laptop, this is a great way to just expand that real estate when you're in a project and maybe not necessarily looking or needing the layers panel at that point. We can stretch them as well, which is very helpful once we get into generating some analytics and some of the GFA, population, job growth, things like that. And when you're comparing multiple options, this is very powerful to adjust. So we'll touch on that a bit later. But basically, we've got our layers input on the left-hand side. So this is where we input all of our data, and then that gets processed. We get that visualized on the map, and then we get an output on the right-hand side through the Urban tab, analytics, and some of the other apps as well. All right, so let's locate our project, and we can start drawing. So I've loaded into a new project. If you've got a second screen, I encourage you to sort of draw along, and it might sort of spark some questions as we go. But what I'm going to do to draw my boundary, we can go up the top here and draw site boundary, and it'll sort of put you into this polygon mode. However, I want to be a little bit more precise in selecting my boundary, as I'm interested in a lot, say this one here on Fig Street. And the best way I can do that is by loading in the cadastre layer. So depending on where you are in the world or in Australia, you will need to sort of locate the cadastre that's applicable to your location. So if you've got a GIS team or someone that supports you, they'd be the best person to approach to get that information if you don't already know. But what we're going to do is add a layer. So we can add a data layer up the top with this little plus icon, and I'm going to look for the cadastre layer. So I know because I'm in New South Wales, the Giraffe team has built out a number of this spatial data library is what we can see in front of us. And a lot of these layers here are open sourced and managed by sort of government entities around Australia and globally as well. So the team has worked hard to build this out as some sort of common use cases and layers that people will be searching for in order to develop their projects. So we can filter them as well. So we've got some filters over here. And if I select that and then sort of scroll down and look for New South Wales, because that's the state that I'm in, and select that. So now all my layers are filtered for New South Wales in Australia, and I can search for the cadastre, and I can see that highlighted here. So that's the first one I want to load. You can upload your own data as well. So across the right here, there's create new layer. So if you're looking to upload an image or a PDF, maybe it's a strategic master plan in a PDF format that you're wanting to overlay onto the cadastre and sort of maybe model up some of those buildings, you can definitely do that here. And there's also a number of other file formats as well, depending on what you're trying to do. I'm just going to click out of the spatial library, and we can see that cadastre appear on the left-hand side now as a layer, and we can also see that populate on the map. So now I can see my, see my boundary. And what I can do now, instead of drawing my site boundary, I can right-click on the map, and what that does is send a query to the system and what available layers are there and what can I interact with them. So here is my sort of drop down of my options. So if I scroll down one, and I've got this number here, and what it's doing is calling on that information in the cadastre layer that I just loaded. We can see the metadata on the left-hand side. So there's a number of properties that are associated with this parcel that I've selected. And there's also options. So back to where my mouse is, if I can set this as my project boundary directly, which is exactly what I want. And so if I select that, it then places my project boundary exactly aligned to that cadastre information, which is what I'm looking for. So now I'm confident in my boundary. I can save my project up the top. It'll give me an option to save this. So if we just call webinar 101, and we can save this project. There's a number of other properties here, depending if you're working in a company, that you can sort of make mandatory fields if you're trying to understand certain properties about each project that your team are working on. So maybe it's a value, maybe it's a stage in the project pipeline, etc. But that's more a part of an advanced course anyway. So now I've saved my project, it's loaded me into that project, which is nice. And I can see up in my project drop-down list that I've got now my December webinar 101, whereas previously it was in an unsaved project work state. And now what I can do is start populating the map with a little bit more information. So yes, we've got the cadastre loaded in, but it would be helpful to understand some of the zoning information, the FSR, FAR, depending on where you are, about this site. So I'm going to go back to my spatial library, so the plus icon on the left-hand side, and I'm going to select that. And I didn't save my filter, so that's why it sort of returned to that default. And so if I do that one more time, and let's unselect, scroll down to where is N, New South Wales, and I need to hit this little save icon here. And so that way it'll remember the next time I come into my spatial library. And what I would like is some zoning information. So I'm just using the search bar here, grabbing that zoning information, maybe heritage as well, that might be important, just to see how my site's affected. And floor space ratio, we'll bring that one in as well, so we can understand what the capacity is of the site. All right, so we can see those 3 layers have all loaded in. I can see that nicely on the map, but they're sort of crowding each other at the moment. So you do occasionally get a little warning here, and it's an overly sensitive warning. So the layer may still work. It just sometimes appears as it's too sensitive and picking up very minor errors. So something we're aware of. But if I turn this one off, so we can turn the layer off completely with the little eye icon. If you're familiar with other platforms, any Adobe, any sort of software in the Adobe suite, very similar. The opacity, there's a scrubber as well. So if we turn off, say, the land zoning as well, and let's maybe drop the cadastre down to about 50% or so. You can also type directly. So if I wanted to bump that up to 60, you can adjust that straight away. And so now I can see just my heritage layer, and I can see this sort of brown color populating on the map. And my site looks pretty good, so I'm happy with that. I can sort of be comfortable in my decision there. I'll turn that one off, and I'll turn on my floor space ratio, so I can see there's a 4:1 that applies to this site here that I'm looking at. And once we have an understanding of the sort of data surrounding our site and some of the controls, we can actually group those layers and turn them off, because we don't want to have this visible the whole time while we're drawing, as it can make it, we don't want to overpopulate the map and make it busy and confusing. So the way we can do that is by grouping layers. So if we could turn these ones back on for now, I can actually drag them on top of each other. So you'll see the little blue rectangle, and I can drop that. It then prompts me with a group. And so if I say LEP controls, I want to group them all together, and then I'll drag heritage in there as well. I can collapse this group now. So this helps me maintain good layer hygiene. So I can keep a consolidated list here, doesn't get too overwhelming, and I can turn that complete group, that whole group off in one go, which is quite nice as well. So if I sort of collapse this group as well, we can see that it's a nice consolidated list that we've got developing here. We do need to add some drawing layers as well, and we can do that by going up the top here to the little pencil icon. So each of the layer types has an icon associated to it, and we can see that. So this is a default drawing layer. It populates with every project. You can't remove it, and we encourage you just to create more new drawing layers that you can then sort of rename and draw on. So, and that's with the pencil icon. That means it's a drawing layer. And we've got two other types of data layers. So the symbol here indicates that it is a vector layer, this 3D buildings layer, and this sort of image here means it's a raster layer. So there's a difference there in that a vector layer obviously understands its position relative to other aspects within that layer, whereas a raster doesn't understand that information, and that's why it can get pixelated sort of as you zoom in. But what Giraffe can do is actually apply what we call a lens onto a vector layer. So we can only do it on a vector layer. And you might have noticed that if I hover over this layer, there's the absence of a table here. Whereas if I hover over this vector layer, we can see that table appear, and that's prompting us to open the lens table, which is quite nice. So if I open this lens table now, what it does is what we can see visually on the map with this 3D buildings layer, we can see in table format below. So there's a whole session on this in terms of how we can sort of filter this data. So if I wanted to filter the data here, so if we were only looking for office types within this data set, I could say equals and then type in office, and so it'll filter and only display. So we can see a number of the geometry actually disappeared from the screen, and we're only really left with what that 3D layer understands to be an office. And so if you had your own data set with some of the metrics that you're interested in, depending on your project, you could then bring that in here and gain additional insight by filtering out that information, whether it's sort of the building age, the types of office, of residential, maybe the height of it as well. And we can sort of get a bit of a lens on that data and gain some insight there. So I'm just going to clear that filter, as there's one of the other things I wanted to show you with this lens table, which is crucial to getting started in a project, as I'm lucky in this instance that there's no existing buildings on this site. Rarely that will happen. There's usually always the case that there's some sort of built form on the site, and we don't necessarily want to draw over the top of that, and we don't necessarily want to turn that entire layer off, because it is helpful having that context, contextual surroundings. So what I want to do is, if I open up the lens tool back again, is apply a filter. So there's a filter icon here that we can add, and I want to draw a boundary filter. So if I select boundary here, and what it's going to do is ask me to exclude or include, and I want to exclude the information of within my boundary, and then I'm going to draw my boundary. So let's say that maybe this adjacent site wasn't accurate, and there was an approved DA potentially on this site that I wanted to model in, that was publicly available. So if I draw a boundary around that, double click, and what we can see is that it's filtered out that data, which allows us to start fresh on that site and draw in the more accurately the contextual building, the new approved sort of development that we want to display there. So I can hit done. I'm just going to save that on my lens table, and I can close that out. So that's what the normal process. So if that was my site I started with, I'd clear the buildings from it, and then I could start drawing, create my site boundary, and then start drawing my project, starting from a blank slate, which is nice. All right, so let's jump in and do some drawing now. I've sort of rambled on a little bit about the setup and some of the UI, but if there is, again, any questions throughout, just sort of drop them in the chat and I'll jump onto them. But we're going to jump into drawing now. So I want to create a new drawing layer because I don't want to draw on this default one. And I'm just going to select the pencil plus icon, and we'll call this option 1. And maybe I want to do an option 2 as well. So that's another powerful sort of aspect within Giraffe, is that because it is sort of a highly, this process that you're in is a highly iterative in terms of you're always making changes, pushing and pulling mass, adjusting floor levels. And so you do tend to build out a number of options. And what we can do with analytics is actually compare those options in terms of their GFA, maybe the population, the number of dwellings, how many one beds are each of them providing, and draw some conclusions based on that data. All right, so I'm going to start with option 1. I'm just selecting, so the active layer is the green icon. So as I sort of cycle between them, you can see that go active. And then anything I draw now will be on that layer. Excuse me. And when we start drawing, there's sort of a multiple ways to approach this. There's a good cheat sheet that everyone should know. So when you are sort of stuck or running into problems about where some controls might be, you've obviously got the drawing bar up the top, which I'll run through in a second. But if you hit spacebar on your keyboard, it also brings up a number of functions and commands as well. So, and then you've got the associated shortcut, keyboard shortcut, which if you're sort of familiar with Revit or other design platforms, they'll become your best friend when you're modeling, which is a great way to just enhance your workflow. And I highly encourage you to sort of have a look at that and sort of experiment with them. Okay, so there's 2 ways we can draw, and I'm going to talk you through sort of drawing a basic geometry and then what we call usages in Giraffe. So I'm just going to hit, well, actually, let's go at the top. So I've got basic shapes up the top. I'm just going to select that and select rectangle from the option. I'm going to toggle into 2D mode. So you can do that down the right hand in the map controls here, or you can hit T on your keyboard and that will toggle you into that new view, which is nice. And I can start to draw my rectangle. So I'll just rotate that onto my site, and we'll draw this a little bit more precisely in a second. And then I'm going to toggle back into my 3D mode. And what we have is just a basic feature or geometry. It understands very little about itself. It's got your perimeter, it's got an area, and that's about it. So what we can do in Giraffe is add properties to that. So on the left-hand side, we'll see our properties tab has now been indicated or has been sort of drawn on by default because we've selected our geometry. If I select away that, it goes back to the layers panel, and then selecting our geometry, we get those properties panel come up. So, and I want to add a property, and I'm just going to add a few so we can demonstrate what happens to this geometry. And let's say I want to add a color. Let's add an opacity, and let's add a height. So I'm just typing and searching for these, and we can see them populate on the left-hand side in the properties panel. So now we can actually adjust them. So if I wanted to change that height, we can see it grow. If I wanted to change this to a red, and then opacity, maybe we want to drop that down to make it a little less intense. So now we've got something that's starting to look like something, but we don't know much information about this, and it was a bit of work to build up. So the idea is that we can get you to this stage and further without having to manually add these properties in each time. So the first method to do that is drawing a rectangle again. So I'm just going to rotate that one. I'm not drawing in 2D mode, I should be, but that's all right. Being sort of very liberal here with how I place it. And so now I've still got my basic rectangle, which is the same step we were at before, but instead of adding properties, I want to select the usage. So the usage panel on the left-hand side here, again, in the properties tab, here I can see what layer it is on as well. So if I accidentally drew it on option 2 and it was supposed to be on option 1, I can just change that quite easily. But I can select a usage here as well. So a usage is sort of predefined settings based on industry standard that the team has built out. And if I scroll through, we can see sort of 1-bedroom units, some amenity, commercial, community. There's a number of different types here that you can select on. And what the intention here is that we provide you with a bit of a foundation. And like a lot of things in Giraffe, it's all very highly configurable. So you would start from, say, the residential. So if I select the residential building section, it'll populate. It knows that it's 10 levels by default. And it knows some other information about itself as well, which is why we're getting some numbers on the right-hand side already, whereas previously we weren't getting that. So if I delete this, these numbers all drop down to 0 because this geometry was very basic in its form that it didn't understand how to translate that information through to analytics. And that's why we built usages, as it is able to talk through what we draw and process that through into the analytics, which is very helpful in terms of generating that data very quickly. And so just returning back to my earlier comment and rounding that out is that this residential usage is like a starting point. So we supply you with this. We've made some assumptions, and within your workflow or your company, it's up to you to sort of configure this and change it to suit your particular workflow. So maybe your residential buildings don't have a floor to floor of, say, like 3.6 or something like that, and that's your sort of standard. And what we can do is configure these settings. So we need to go into the usage editor, which previously I touched on very briefly, but in the left-hand side, we've got this tabbed menu, and it's this one here. So the usage editor is one I want to select. And if I select that, we get this little flyer, and this is basically a breakdown of all of the assumptions that are being made behind the scenes for this residential usage before being translated through to the urban tab on the right-hand side. So we can see here, there's a floor-to-floor height. So this is the 3.2. So if your usage was 3.6, for example, you can jump in and change this to 3.6. There's efficiency applied to it as well, which is all, again, configurable. So depending on how many cores, whether you have cross-draw apartments or something within your design, you can sort of adjust that and have control over that efficiency. There's a nice little graphic here that you can sort of visualize to understand how that conversion is happening. There's also a dwellings mix as well. So currently, which we can see on the right-hand side, we've got 161 total dwellings, and we've got a breakdown displayed here and a percentage assigned to each. So if we were looking at this as more of a student housing, for example, and we just wanted studio and 1-beds, we didn't want any 3-bed, 2-beds. So we can just drag this slider to the end, and it then removes that. And so now we've got a 20-80 split. And so if we wanted to adjust that to be more of a 40-60, now I've got 40% studios, 60% 1-beds. And I can see the properties associated with the studio and 1-bed here. So they're assumed a studio average size, sort of 45 square meters, which is quite large. And then a 1-bed that's at sort of 60 square meters. So I could jump in and change that if I wanted to and drop that down to 55. And there's some other attributes here, which we won't dive into today, but it is very configurable in its nature. And that is by design to allow you guys the flexibility to suit your workflow. And the idea here is that you'd come in, we'd make those changes, and then you could either clone the usage, so you could create your own one. So if I save this one first, just because I've made those changes already, and we can see over on the right-hand side that because we intended this to be student housing, the 2 and 3 beds that we pulled off the scale here are now 0, which is by design. And now we've got our 40-60 split and our apartments tallying there. If I wanted to bring them back, it is very simple. It's just sort of dragging them back on, which is very straightforward. But if I wanted to clone this usage and create one that was quite similar, but maybe it had a different floor to floor, you can select clone usage here. And this could be Resi 02. Save changes, save and change. And so now we're looking at the Resio 2, and if we wanted to change this just so we can see that visualized on the map, we'll make it a sort of a green color here, and let's jump the floor to floor to maybe it's a 4.5. So if we save those changes now, and we've created a new usage. So now if I go back, this is still the same usage because what we did was clone that and then edit the clone. So if I copy this and I'm just holding Option or Alt on my keyboard and then selecting and dragging that, and now I want this building over here to be my new residential usage. So if I search for Resi 2 over in the usage panel, I can see my Resio 2 now is listed there. If I select that, it then builds in all of those properties that I changed, the new floor to floor, the new color, and any other properties that we wanted to change there. So that's nice and good to understand that level of configurable elements within the platform. We can also see that breakdown. So talking more to the urban metrics that we can see on the right here. So we've got a GBA, we've got a GFA, and an NSA breakdown. We can see the split by the usage here, which is Resio 2 and residential. We can control that split as well. Excuse me. Got the hiccups. We can control how we split that as well. So it's currently splitting it by usage. You could split it by the building or the group. So you can group elements in Giraffe as well. And that way you could sort of filter and organize them in that manner as well. I find usage the most helpful. And we also get an FSR populating here. So that site FSR is being driven by our site boundary. And as soon as we look at multiple sites, there are other methods that we can do in order to calculate that. So if there was a neighboring site as well, you obviously are not using a single FSR, you have multiple FSRs. So that is something we can do. And if you're interested, please feel free to reach out, as that's sort of a separate discussion and not something we'll cover in today's 101. But we can see, looking down that list, there's a number of other helpful metrics in terms of the building, the hardscape, open space, some metrics on the form that we've created, and also a car parking allocation as well. So currently there's 0 out of a required 262, and this number is being generated by the usage. So where I was back in the usage editor, so just remembering one more time, over here, the usage editor, there's a number of cars that are required. So here we've got a 1 car per dwelling and the same for the 1 bed. So that's what is driving this number over on the right-hand side. So we can see, because we've got a total yield of 261, looks like there's a rounding of up to 262 because we're just providing 1 space per apartment. And we can, so adding in a car park is again through the top. So we haven't really touched on the drawing toolbar, and I'm going to do that now. We've only sort of gone into the basic shapes element, which is sort of self-explanatory. It's got your rectangle, polygon, a line, and a point output there. But going from left to right, we've got the buildings tab. So this is exactly what we did before, but it's basically a shortcut method. Instead of drawing a rectangle first, we can select here, and straight away we can see that residential usage, and we should also see the Resio 2, which is down here, the new one that we created. And if I select that, I can then start to draw, and it will populate exactly the same as what I did before, but rather you sort of skip that step where you draw the rectangle at the start. So depending on your workflow, that's probably a quicker method in order to get to this end result, if you know what type of usage you're drawing straight away. Moving along, the next one is the landscape. Here we also have the parking. So this is something I want to return to that earlier comment, just out of this requirement. So if I go into here and let's say we put a multi-deck, and maybe we put it rotate it, and let's just drop it underneath. We're going to actually remove this original box that we drew, and we're just going to drop it in here. So you can start to see that visualize. We can control the properties on the left-hand side. So could start to grow that podium. You could also stack it as well if it was supposed to go under these two buildings. That is also an option as well. So you'll see them sort of stack on top of each other, and we control that stack order through the properties. So if I select that, you can see a stack order, and this number should always be sort of the highest number on top. So we can see the stack order of the car park is a 1, and then the buildings above that are a 2. You can change that as well. So the parking type is currently a multi-deck. You could drop that to underground. We can't visualize below the ground plane. So you're reliant on the levels attribute on the left-hand side there. So, and we can see on the right-hand side now that we've got a 6 level underground car parking for this development, that we're oversupplying our number of cars there. So I can sort of bring that back to 5. And let's say at 4 levels, it's sort of a little bit under, but let's say maybe 3 is ideal, and maybe we just increase the size of that so we can allow for that. And maybe there's a contingency sort of built in there as well. So we don't have to go too deep there. We'll just stick with the 3 levels. And so that's quite nice. We can get a quick understanding of how that metric is performing. And now we can start to build out this design a little bit further. So we're only looking at the urban metrics at the moment. And I want to build out this design a little bit more. So we're still on option 1. Let's say that I'm not really a fan of this green color. So I'm going to actually just jump back into the usage editor, and let's adjust that. Maybe it's maybe an orange is more suitable. Let's make sure we save that change. Yeah, it's orange. I'm happy with that. All right. So let's say that this residential tower on this site, that we wanted to build a retail component underneath it. And the way we do that is if I copy and paste it, so Control C, Control V, it's stacking it on top of each other. And if I select this bottom one, or let's select the top one and make sure that that's on the stack order 2, so that's always going to be above. And then if I select this bottom one and change the usage, I know that there is a retail usage already built into the platform. And so I can select the retail usage there and then drop the levels down to, say, 2 floors. And I can then start to grow that and change it as well. So if I toggle into 2D mode, and we'll just undo that and make sure we grab both of them, I can sort of drag, and you will notice that I'm very askew from that front boundary. So in order to align that, if I hit spacebar on my keyboard, again, bringing up that command list, I want to use a base point move. So if I select base point move here, this allows me to move an object based on an origin point. So if I hold S on my keyboard, that allows me to snap to the points. And so I want to move this point here, and I want to snap it to my front boundary corner there. So if I make sure that's snapped, and now what I want to do is rotate that. So again, spacebar to the command list, base point rotate. And the same thing, I want to hold S and snap to that edge there, snap to the other edge of my building, and then rotate that back to align to the boundary. And so now I'm sort of relatively happy that that's aligned, and I can start to build out that form. There's another way to do that as well, which I'll cover in option 2. But if we wanted to pull that, say, 6 meters back from the boundary, I can hit 6 on my keyboard, it'll snap to 6 meters, and we can start to look at that design a little bit more thoroughly. So I'm currently in an edit mode at the moment. So when you are drawing you select the geometry, and it brings up some controls in order for you to change that. So previously I selected this retail component and dragged it out. So like SketchUp and other design platforms, there's sort of a push and pull toggle here. There's nodes that are currently at each corner. And so I can grab that, move that around freely. I'm not going to move that one too much, so I'll just undo that. We can also segment our lines. So there's a temporary plus node in the middle of each line, and this allows us to further segment that line. So now that I've clicked that, it becomes a node, and I can now drag a portion of this. So this is when we can start to articulate that facade and start to maybe develop the design a little bit more into a more realistic building form. And we can also, if I jump up to this one as well, and just add some nodes, and we can start to give a bit of character to this design here. When you are moving the nodes around as well, if I toggle into 2D mode, you can hold shift, which will snap you into your sort of 90-degree plane, so you can bring it back to that rectilinear shape. So if you drag it like this, and then maybe you change your mind, you can hold shift to snap that back. If I wanted to, say, drag this element out and make sure it aligned here, I can click and drag those arrows and then hold S on my keyboard to make sure I snap to that point there, which gives me a level of accuracy when I'm sort of playing with this design and changing things. I'm just going to undo that one there. And so now we can sort of start to build out our form. All of this information on the right is dynamic and adjusting. So if I decide, okay, I want to add an extra towers, let's grow it to 15, we can see that GFA number is adapting all the time as we make those changes. So very responsive in terms of the numbers and feedback you get on your design and some of the changes that you're making. Yes, okay, so this is sort of option one. It's not ideal, but we're just going to jump into an option two so I can demonstrate that comparative attribute within Giraffe. So you can also duplicate a layer as well. So if I got to this stage and then decided, oh, there's an iteration where I don't want to include these two buildings, I can duplicate that layer and then start from scratch and then start to remove them. So if I go up to the layers option, there's an option here to duplicate. And now I have a copy of that layer. So I can turn off that original option one. I can rename this one. Maybe it's option 1A, for example. And I wanted to test maybe no car park, delete those towers, and maybe we rotate this sort of 90 degrees and reposition it over here. And if I'm just hitting R on my keyboard, toggling into 2D mode with T, and then I want to draw a landscape element. So I'll go back up the top here to landscape, and we'll just grab a simple landscape, and I'll rotate that one. And so let's say this was our other option for option 1A, and we wanted to explore this design, and maybe let's just duplicate this tower over here. And so we've got two towers that we're looking at. You can also slice. I'm sort of just thinking of common tools that I use. So if I wanted to scale back this design, or maybe I wanted to slice through, so we've got a sort of green connection through the site, I can select that geometry, hit X on my keyboard, which is sort of a split slice. Again, you can find that in spacebar and search for the command there. So I think it's split, and it's got X as the assigned shortcut for that. And I can just cut through that and split those into segments. And I say, I want to remove that, and I want to grow this green space into there. So I'm going to add 2 nodes and then extrude that and just start to play with that shape and better understand how. So I can start to adjust that landscape, which is nice. And we're obviously getting that information update on the right-hand side as well. Okay, so this is, I'm happy with that as my option 2 or option 1A, and I can toggle between those options as well. So if I turn back on option 1, we've got this one, and then got the other option that we're exploring. So the next step is I want to touch on analytics as well, because I think that's quite a powerful feature when you are exploring options in Giraffe. There are some other drawing tools up in the drawing toolbar. So land uses is another one, which is very similar to the buildings section, but this is more targeted at urban planners or strategic planners that are looking at large envelopes. So maybe it's, if you imagined this whole envelope as a site, and then you're making some assumptions about that. So if I select a land use, we can see some common usages here. So this area is high density residential, we'd say. And it gives you basically an envelope that you can then start to map out. So without understanding too much about the site, you're very early in the project. So you've got a site in question, and maybe it's looking to be rezoned, subdivided, whatever the case may be. This allows you to plan for that without understanding the individual planning controls. And that's when we would start to use the building sections, which I've done there. But this would be at that larger scale. And we can still build in some assumptions into this in terms of the site efficiency and an FSR. So we could say 80% of this site is actually going to be subdivided. The remaining 20% is allowed for infrastructure, roads, and whatnot in the subdivision. And then we can apply FSR to that remaining 80% to get an indication of what yield we could get out of that at a very high level, I must admit, but still getting those metrics from that envelope scale. But I'm going to remove that one, because what we're looking at is this building section. We know the site, we know some setbacks, and we know some of the planning controls around that. The next one is the shape tools, which we covered. Flow Builder is it's a fun tool. I encourage you guys to get in and have a play around. However, it is part of a more advanced session. But just to give you an idea, the idea here is that you generate an algorithm based on a simple geometry. So I'm just drawing a line here that's, say, 100 meters long, and I'll finish that. And then it turns into this apartment building. And we can see some of the typologies here of like a 3-bed, a 2-bed, and a 1-bed. And we can start to sort of manipulate and play with that as well. It still speaks to all the data on the right-hand side, but just allows you to get to that end stage a little bit quicker. And there's some further attributes on the left-hand side. But again, this is more advanced feature, but a fun one to jump in and explore. So feel free to have a look at the flows and the annotate tab. So as I showed in the other project, we had sort of some labels on it, which was quite nice just to sort of tell that story. So if I quickly jump in here, excuse me. If we wanted to add a text to say this is our proposed development, proposed development background, let's say white. I want to change the shape. So there's some like graphic settings that you can change. We can put it up on a stick, which is quite nice. So you can sort of prop it up, and maybe let's make that like 60. And so you get a nice little label that you can communicate your design. I'll turn off world space as well, so that way it doesn't grow as I zoom in and out. But that's quite nice to start tell a story. So you can imagine here if I created an arrow and maybe it's a proposed green link that goes through the site and connects with Wentworth Park. And what we can do with each of these is save them as views. So views on the left-hand side here, I can add a view with the little camera icon. And let's say this is a home view. We could add a description and then hit save. And that just saves a snapshot in time of those active layers that I had. So I can navigate between say this is option 1A, and then I could create another. So if I go back into here, turn off option 1A, turn back on option 1, and then go back to views. Let's snap a view of option 1, and let's call this option 1, and then hit save. So we created our two views. This should be called option 1A, but it's home for now. And we can toggle between them quite quickly just by selecting on the view, and it turns all of those active layers on in order to visualize what you can see on the map. So we can see with this option, we didn't have any of the annotations on there, whereas this one, we had added that there. So a nice way to flick between options within your project, and rounding out that sort of whole options scenario as well is then moving into the analytics. So there's the measure tool and more options as well, but I won't cover them off in this session. They're sort of measures self-explanatory, and more options is some features in there that feel free to jump in and have a look around. But I'm going to move into analytics. So if I jump into analytics here, there's an option to start with a template, or you can start with a blank state. I do encourage any new user to start with a template, as it gives you a bit of an idea of, again, what is capable. And then you can potentially go back and reverse engineer some of these metrics that are being calculated here, which is very powerful. Again, something that's configurable, and we provide a template that's sort of based on industry standard and what people are generally looking for. So we can see down the list there, we've got some landscaped area. We've got a tree count. Currently, we have no trees, but if I was to go into here, select a tree, drop that on the site, we can see now we have one tree populating on the right here. There's building footprint, the FSR is being calculated here. We've got a site area. We've got a total population, which is being driven by the number of dwellings that we have assigned for this option. So this is like a whole hour in itself, but a good way to understand it is that there's an Excel spreadsheet behind the scenes. And if I click on that, this is sort of that spreadsheet and where those calculations are happening. Excuse me. And then we're surfacing the result on the right-hand side here. So that's what we can see in each of these tabs up the top. However, the focus, what I wanted to show you here is we can drag this out, which is a lovely little addition with the new Giraffe 5. I'm very excited about being able to drag that out. We can group by layers. So if I go up the top here, there's an option to group by and say, okay, I can see my landscaped area, I can see my sort of net building area, but what if I wanted to look at my options side by side? And so that's where we can group by layer. So if I scroll down to layer, I can now see option 1 and option 1A. And so I know that I didn't draw any landscaped area on my option 1, but I did draw this, which is on my option 1A. And so we can see that difference here and that comparison very easily, which is quite nice. So you can start to draw comparisons from, say, the total dwellings. Option 1A is saying total dwellings is 0. Was he? Interesting. I think that's probably a user error on my behalf. But yes, being able to draw those comparisons is quite powerful there. So let's actually, I want to just experiment on this and change this to say residential. There we go. So I think it was something to do with the clone that we created there. And maybe I made an error as to why that wasn't coming through. But now I've moved them back to a residential usage. We can see those total dwellings are coming through as they should, which is great. All right, we only have a few minutes left, and I've probably rambled on a little bit too long about certain attributes, but to give you an understanding, there is solar and terrain. So with every project, you get 4 core Giraffe apps. So Urban tab, which we've looked at, analytics, this one here, which is all your data. And this is a more in-depth sort of insight into that data. While Urban gives you a bit of an overview and a snapshot of that, Analytics allows you to dive in there and control that data and how it comes out. The Solar tool, if I run an analysis, it'll have a think for a moment, and then it'll apply this color overlay. And so I can see how that facade's performing. If I hover my mouse over, I can see that there's the amount of hours that is being received by both the facade and the landscape area. And what I've got here on the right-hand side is a window. So if it's a 9 till 3 window, I can adjust that and then reassess how that is performing. So we get a breakdown here of the landscape versus the facade and a requirement of the hours of sunlight. So I've set it as 3 and we can see that, which is performing not too bad at all. So that's a great little tool, especially in New South Wales here with the ADG and the relevant controls that we have to adhere to for sunlight. Terrain is the last one that I want to cover off, and that is that's had a big refresh, which is great. It's a lot more simple to use. So I've just selected the terrain tool and I want to enable my terrain. And what it does is, based on your site boundary, basically cuts out that information from the tile and will pop your buildings up onto that terrain. So there's an option here, clip to site boundary. And if I untick that, we can see that whole tile of data will load in. But because of performance, we want to try and maximize that for each user. We encourage you to sort of clip that site boundary, and so you can focus on your individual project. And just quickly, there's an option here to sort of color the terrain. So I'm going to select the color terrain based on cut and fill, so I can see whether I need fill or I need to cut the site. And then I'm just going to add a building pad with the little plus icon down here. Toggle into 2D mode, and let's say, just drawing very roughly across here, this is my building pad that I want to prop the this development up on. And if I toggle back now, we can see that there's a subtle red here because we're cutting into the site. And if I increase that, we can see that red becoming a little bit more prominent as we increase sort of the intensity there. And just to further emphasize that fact, let's bring it up. So say if it was a fill required and we were pushing that project up, building up quite a bit, we can adjust the elevation datum of that building pad. So if I jump in here and I say maybe 30, so let's just, and so now we can see it's like quite a vibrant green. It's pushed that up. We've got an angle of repose as well. So if I select that building pad, we can actually adjust that angle of repose here, depending on our site conditions. So that's obviously extremely steep. But if you're looking at something around the 30 degrees, maybe that's a bit more realistic, noting that we are pushing that well above what you would normally do. Yes, so that's the terrain tool, and we're sort of on time there, so I don't want to run over too much, but if there are any questions, please drop them in the chat. We covered quite a lot in this session, so I will be following up with a link to our knowledge base, and also we've built out a YouTube Academy as well, so I'll send that through, and that sort of talks through what I've mentioned in today, just in sort of some logical chunks of sort of 3 to 5 minute videos on how to do certain steps, going from start to finish. So hopefully that can help you guys. And then obviously the recording as well will come along with this. But thanks again for you guys, for your time, guys, and enjoy the Christmas break, and we'll see you in the new year. Thanks very much, guys.